I feel the loss of not getting to be with more elders around the fire, and getting the opportunity to have more stories passed down through lineage and more stories passed down orally. And it kind of makes me sad that I don't have more examples of stories that light my soul like this story does, that have been given to me in direct transmission. And I think I'm just really glad to be able to share all the stories that we've already shared and more to come. And hope the culture that we're creating is one where we get to share more of these stories in person and have more elders around to tell the stories. This story comes from Martin Shaw. I don't know if anybody's heard of him. He's a wilderness rights guide out of the United Kingdom. And it's from I believe this story is from the Seneca. And it's called The Listener. I'm actually going to turn my camera off so we can just cue into voice a little bit more. And I'm going to go for it here. The Listener from the Seneca. There was once a boy making trouble in the village. There's always a boy making trouble in the village. He was sent to the hut of his uncle, the place where the settlement drifted into the vastness of the dark forest. One day, this uncle, a shaman, sent him out to listen to the sounds of the wild. Not to wrestle a mountain lion, not to slay a wolverine, not to steal the whisker from a wolf, but just to find a big tree, sit under it, and listen. The listener heard a chickadee, the bear, the bleak honk of a raven. For many years he stayed under the great tree and learnt many things. That discipline was the dance partner of wildness. That animals returned to the same song lines again and again. That caution and daring were related. His old friends grew to become warriors and village men, proud and adored, whilst he lived almost forgotten. When people mentioned his name in the village, they scratched their heads and looked quizzical. Whatever happened to him? He was a mystery. He was becoming ghost, but his capacity to listen deeply to the very nature of things grew vast. And over the years, it got so he could call animals to his very breast. One day, very quiet as dusk approached, he heard a song from the mountains in the far west. I am coming to be your wife. 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 It was the deepest thing he'd ever hear. And tears pricked from his eyes, right from his eyes, and he ran back to his uncle. His uncle smiled, saying, "You would never have been able to hear that song without your years under the tree. You must prepare to meet such a one." The men, they went around that enormous bone pile. They touched the moss. They touched the moss like a great ivory hill, all the ones fallen from the mountain. The listener made them gather trees like a vast teepee over the bones, released them to the fall and shouted, "Look out for your lives!" And all of a sudden the bones reanimated. They lurched back into flesh. Hair, eyes, life, lots of blinking humans looking for a home. There is a price when you wake things up. Each of the 9 men took a large group of the people, some who had not seen their home for hundreds of years, and started out to build new communities, new cultures. Later on, as the boy was leaving that community, now a man, as a listener, he walked, and he walked alone, some say for many years, into the middle of his life. He walked on a road that had many others on it, much chatter, so many distractions. But sure enough, one day he came to something so vast he could not skirt around it. He entered the longhouse and was completely immersed in darkness. He kept his eyes straight ahead, for the tiny chink of light he could see was around the far distant door. He was resolute. He almost made it, and then at that very last moment, a light This melodious voice, so fragrant and beguiling, made him turn his gaze just for a second from the glint. Just for a single second, and standing there was a spirit, shrouded in a buckskin robe, a robe adorned entirely with men's eyes. In a second, his eyes leapt from their sockets, scuttled across the floor and onto the robe, jostling in amongst thousands of others. Hard hands grabbed him and hurled him, blind, out into the scrub outside the longhouse. He was left for dead. And dead he would be, were it not for his capacity to listen, as he did, just as he did as a boy, to the emanations of the forest, just enough to find streams, berries, the occasional squirrel. It was a life that marked him. He was a thin man stumbling, scratched and bereft. He was reduced and reduced and reduced again into stature of a man little more than a crawler. But it would appear he crawled through different ages and times, from the erotics of the cave hunt to the time of the seeding in the field. And one day he realized, astonished, that he had come to the edge of the forest. Here, finally, his hand stroked a stem of corn, and he realized that he was in a growing place, this field of the sacred corn. A young woman kept the field of corn, and when he heard her voice, he caught, just for a second, the cadence of the bright daughter. The bright daughter. Surely this was a mistake. Just his battered heart, the once great hero bent low and offered his services as a scarecrow to simply keep the birds away from the harvest. The woman went to consult with her mother inside the hut, and he heard this odd cackle, and for a moment froze, surely not. But then he heard kind words of support and encouragement, and he put thoughts of the dark mother to the back of his mind. His appearance would surely scare the birds, and he would sit alone for many hours by the gently moving corn. He loved that sound. At dusk, the maiden would sometimes sit with him and they would listen together. And one day he heard the movement of an animal and asked for a bow and arrow. A blind man? With a bow and arrow? The old woman only had a smoky bow and one arrow, some say crooked, and that it hung above her fireplace these many years. But she gave it to the man. He tilted his head and shot true, and a deer gave itself to his intention. The women were glad, and, they skinned the deer, and on some strange instinct, he asked for the eyes of the animal. And he placed those very eyes in his sockets, and now he could see. But not quite how a man sees, not quite how a deer sees, but somewhere in between. In time, that vision began to fade, and he began to hunt again, this time elk, then bear, and he would see with their very eyes. It continued this way for a very long time. One night, the maiden came to the scarecrow man, put her hot hands on him, and they took their fill of each other.